Hi there guys, a few of you have asked if I can show you some more Christmas Carol examples. I think lots of you seem to be doing that for your exams. So I wanted to show you a response I've done to a sample AQA question, which is focusing on Christmas. So the extract is there, so you could have a look at it, pause it there, and the question underneath is around how far does Dickens present Christmas as a joyful time in the extract and obviously in the novel as a whole. Now I've highlighted certain bits there in preparation for this, so you could perhaps think about what techniques you can see there, perhaps pause the video and have a think about that before I start going into my analysis. Okay, so with Christmas Carol, you're obviously always going to get the extract. You're always going to have the 2 bullet points that focus on the extract and then the rest of the novel. So it's well worth seeing and spending some planning time to see what can you pick out from there. So we're looking at always at the information at the beginning. So we know that in chapter 2, this is where Scrooge is taken to his past and is able to reflect on his life experiences that have led up to where he is now. So we know that it's gone to the place he used to work. We know that's Fezziwig's. So if you look at some of the examples I've highlighted here, just in terms of Fezziwig's response to it being Christmas, well, he is laughing. That shows this idea, so we can link that really clearly to it being joyful. And there's this kind of unusual metaphor here. It's slightly ambiguous, actually. He says he laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence. Now, it caused my class a little bit of consternation about what is the organ of benevolence. Well, the way that I interpret this is that if you think about your organs, your heart, your kidneys, your liver, they are something that is vital to you. They are called your vital organs. Without them, you would die. And benevolence is kind of generosity and kindness. So that leaves us with the question of what is his organ of benevolence. So it's something vital to him. Is it his heart? Is it his mind? Or is it actually not a current organ that he might have? Is it something more like his soul? There's something interesting you could do with that. And then we get some information about his voice here. It's oily, rich, fat, jovial. So again, there's a kind of rich generosity to him. He's not hard and sharp as flint in the same way that Scrooge is. And jovial itself means kind of full of joy. Now, what we have in terms of structure, anytime you get a list that doesn't have ands or ors, so if you get a long list with commas, it's actually called an asyndetic list. So if you're just interested in what that is structurally. So then we see as a more basic technique, Dickens' use of dialogue. We see that Fezziwig is prepared to shut up the shop. He's prepared to prioritise having a nice Christmas rather than making more money and staying up. And moving down, we see Scrooge and Dick's reaction to that. They run outside, putting the shutters up. And so just the use, again, of kind of timing or counting as a structural device shows that they were rushing quickly. And that's similarly at the end, shows that they must have been rushing to shut up the business in order to enjoy Christmas. So we get some physical information about Fezziwig. We learn that he's old in that adjective, but then we get the verb skipping, and we're told that he has wonderful agility, which is a noun phrase. But even just the skipping tells us some good information about him, doesn't it? Shows that he's full of energy, full of life. And then as we get some more information about setting, we get this image about fuel was heaped upon the fire. That verb heap shows, again, a kind of generosity, that Christmas is a joyful time and people are being celebratory, warm fires, and we get this list of 3, or these adjectives here, that we get this information that the room is warm and welcoming, and even this comparison here to the ballroom, which is actually a metaphor, of course. His office is not a ballroom. So I would have been spending quite a bit of time on my extract like that, and then what I always advise, I've actually stolen one of my students' booklets for this that we are doing in class. So they've got their highlighter, showing through, which is what that stain is there. So let's see how. Yeah, they've done not too bad a job of annotating there. Right. So what I always advise is in this planning time is to think about the rest of the novel as a whole, and whether it's a play, whether it's your 1A stuff, your Shakespeare, or whether it's a novel, think about, can you get 3 bits of evidence? I think that would be good. So I view with Christmas Carol, this is chapter 1, chapter 2 to 4, and chapter 5. Now, obviously, you may call them staves, depending what school you're in. So how much, how far does Dickens? This means how much. To what extent is Christmas joyful? Well, I sort of try and get students to evaluate this. And really, I think that it's not at all joyful for Scrooge. Now, we see Bob and Fred, who are poorer than Scrooge and actually manage to find joy, but for him, it isn't. And of course, we remember his really famous line of bar humbug, and he also talks about, he can't, he calls Fred a fool for celebrating Christmas and says, he's too poor to enjoy himself. So he is, we know that he spends, for example, Christmas Eve alone eating gruel, despite the fact he's absolutely minted. He elects to be alone in a really kind of miserable experience. So it's not at all joyful. And so I'd be thinking about different examples. I could mention even stuff like the charity workers trying to get money for the poor people to get them some food at Christmas, and he has none of it, does he? So midsections. Well, I might think about, as a child, again, it's not joyful for him, is it? Because we know that he is described as solitary and neglected by his friends, because he's left at the boarding school alone. It's quite a sad image. But then we do get, he had joy, because we've seen here at Fezziwigs that he enjoyed himself. So he does have experiences of that. Now, I've so far been talking about Scrooge, but make sure that this isn't just about him, it's the novel as a whole. So I know, for example, that the Cratchits in chapter 3, they are poor, but they have love and gratitude for what they've got, even though their Christmas dinner is quite small, and they still are appreciative of what they've got. Equally, you get the miners who are all kind of huddling around a fire and singing and celebrating Christmas. So Dickens shows us that yes, there are people for whom Christmas isn't a special time. Scrooge when he was a child. Scrooge now, even though he actually has no need to be, he has a family, he has people he could spend time with, but he doesn't treat it as a special or important time. And then we think about the end. It is, by the end, totally joyful. So we've gone from not all joyful to kind of to a degree, and then by the end, totally joyful. And we have all of those images that he has right at the end. I'm happy as an angel. He goes out into the street and he says Merry Christmas to people. He goes to church and buys a turkey for the Cratchits. So he does a lot of generous acts towards the end, and he talks, doesn't he, at the end of chapter 4 about keeping Christmas in his heart. So I would really recommend you spending 5 or 10 minutes in your exam doing what I've just done, which is to annotate the extract and to think about the other parts of the novel that I could bring in and talk about. Right, I did this essay with my class this week, so if you're watching and I teach you, this will be familiar to you. But we did this together. It's not a complete essay. It's about 2/3 done. But I thought it'd be useful to show you. I'd be confident that this is going to be into grade 8. I'll show you why, but you could have a look at this and think about what else you could add. You could even finish off this essay as a bit of a revision activity. Didn't get finished just because my class were moaning I was going too fast and that their fingers were bleeding, and any other number of excuses. So if we just have a look how I've structured this first page, you'll see, deals with the extract. Second page, I move on to talk about the rest of the novel. So I always start my essays on this within the extract. Dickens does something, it just really shows I'm aware of the writer at work. So in the extract, he presents it as being very special. We can see how exciting Christmas is through the reaction of Fezziwig, Scrooge's boss. The use of the verb laughed and the adjective jovial to describe his voice shows he is merry, jolly and excited, almost as though he is a Father Christmas-like character, giving love and joy to others. Dickens uses the metaphor organ of benevolence to suggest that his kindness and generosity were almost a part of him, like a heart or brain. Without this organ, he would be dead on the inside, a bit like Scrooge at the start. Now, I'm sure that you could see here that we've got writers' methods, techniques, example, and we've got another method and another example here. Well, we've got organ of benevolence, this. But what I wanted to show you, these highlighted bits, because these are the bits that are moving your work up from, if you're on a grade 5, grade 6, this is what's moving you into grade 7 and grade 8. Because what you have here, if this was your work, what you'd show an examiner that you're doing is offering a perceptive interpretation. Interpretation just means your take on it. And perceptive means something that other people would not necessarily find or think to talk about. So that connection to him being kind of round and jolly and laughing and Father Christmas, could have developed that even further there. Brought in the idea of his jovial voice and the way he's, lots of exclamatives. So I could have easily moved that up to a 9 by adding a bit more detail. And then here, this idea that it's part of him, like his heart or his brain. Again, these are two perceptive elements. So Dickens uses dialogue. So again, a method, a technique, and an example. No more work tonight. This shows that Fezziwig was willing to lose money if it meant having happiness. Again, this is, this is a nice, sort of sophisticated point to make. He's able to prioritise Christmas and what it represents over work. At the time Dickens was writing, it's a good sort of way into writing about context, that little sentence starter. Everyone was Christian. It's a bit simplistic, that, but what I want to do is quite a realistic, rather than me as a mid-30-year-old English teacher. So it does sound a bit simplistic and generalised, but it gets to the point. Everybody was a Christian, therefore Christmas was about more than presents. It was a time for love, charity and generosity, so clear context. Towards the end of the extract, Dickens uses a semantic field, more methods, more examples. A fire, fuel was heaped, snug and warm, and fire. We associate warmth with generosity and being hospitable, so there's a clearer sense of analysis and interpretation. Fezziwig is caring for people by providing a warm, comfortable place to be. This contrasts with the feeble fire at, I should have put here, Scrooge's school, and the miserable fire in his office. The warmth transforms the office into a ballroom, showing how special the Christmas atmosphere is here. Okay, so I've made, a few different examples. I've tried to really sort of zoom in the same way I would have done if this was a language question. And I think that is something important. People fear the literature exams, but really they're just like bigger language papers. You've just got to keep it going longer. So then moving on to the rest of the novel. So in the rest of the novel, Christmas is not always a special time. Slightly evaluative there. So in the beginning of the novel, and you can see how that then refers to the plan we've got here. It is not valued at all by Scrooge. Now, I have put that in because clearly Bob and Fred do love Christmas. He repeats the phrase, which is repetition in language, bar humbug, for examples, which he uses to show how he disregards Christmas and those who celebrate it. So just having that in there, that's, again, a bit more perceptive. It's showing it's not just an attitude towards Christmas. It's also about anyone who enjoys it. He is unimpressed with. He dislikes that. And then we've got a textual reference here because we've got the reference to the charity workers. When they come into his office asking for money for the poor, he's livid. He's appalled and offended by this. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? So direct quote. At the time, so again, we've got some context in here. At the time, poor people had no option but to go to these places. Social reformers like Dickens were inspired to demand improvements and tried to raise awareness. Here Dickens uses Scrooge's terrible reaction to show that for many, Christmas was a bleak, hopeless time. So I've got context, but there's a real link to the text. It's not just kind of bolted on. On Christmas Eve, Scrooge is alone. His enormous house is dark and cold, and he eats gruel. You know, I think at the top end, I want to see students using embedded quotes like that. Okay. Scrooge is hugely wealthy, and yet he refuses to spend even a small sum of money on Christmas. He can afford to, but he is miserly, storing and hoarding money rather than spending it on things that would benefit him and others. Christmas is meant to be a joyful, special time, but for Scrooge, it is a bleak and lonely time. It helps us to see how dramatic his change is. He goes from a miserable, solitary man to one who keeps Christmas in his heart, realising it is a symbol for love. Okay, so this end of this was getting a bit rushed because it was approaching lunchtime here in my school, and my classroom was right near the canteen. Everyone could smell fish fingers, I think. So we got a little bit rushed towards the end. What I would have been doing if I'd carried on would then actually talk more about the middle part of the novel, and I'd leave some of this till right at the end of my essay. So I know that the question people will ask me is, how much need I have written for this? What I'd be looking for is, obviously I've done 2 full sides. I think that with another full side in that quality, I would be happily looking at this as a grade 8 piece of work, if not 9. What I think, the reason I'm not 100% confident it would be 9 is that there are points, say here, where I could have extended the level of perception. I could have given a few more examples. I could have extended and perhaps linked in context, attitudes to Christmas, but also what it symbolises for Christians in terms of generosity. So I could perhaps have done a tiny bit more. But hopefully you can see from that the key skills are making sure you spend a good amount of thinking time when you're looking at your extract, annotate, look for different elements, plan for what you're going to talk about in the rest of the novel, and then make sure that you're trying to interpret the examples that you've got and that you've written down, really sort of showing or talking about what you think that they show, what do they reveal, and keep at the heart of it. Dickens, what does he do? What are his techniques, and what is he really trying to convey to us as readers? Okay, thank you so much for watching. Hope it was useful.